I am like notable at the fights because I'm pretty much like the only actual fan of Henry Cejudo. You know, not so much as a dude.
I really wish I'd known that before we started, before we invited you.
Yeah.
Welcome, one and all, to another edition of Heavy Hands. I am your host, Connor Rebush, joined, as always, by my co-host, Phil McKenzie. And Phil, it's become clear to me, listening to episodes lately, that I should, let you say hello before I then just go into 3 minutes of me just sort of sticking random thoughts together with chewing gum and duct tape. So, Phil.
How's it going?
It's going great. You can tell we're pros. We're old hands at this. And we are very, very happy, very pleased, very lucky to be joined today by yet another member. You can tell I'm nervous. I'm always nervous around the youth. Yet another member of the feared Twitter gang, the vaping scooter gang, from the fight site. Perhaps what might be called either the ringleader or the tough, the muscle of the crew, the most terrifying man online, Danny Martin. And have I hyped you up too much?
No, that was a hell of an intro.
Okay, great.
Thank you guys for having me. Hopefully I don't prove to be quite as gritty face-to-face, well, on a podcast as I am shouting at and popping off on Twitter.
Are you implying that people communicating via text on social media might inherently come across as more rude than they are interpersonally?
Well, I don't know. You've mentioned me quite a bit on here. And it's a little...
yeah, usually has like the second most disagreeable member of the crew, either after Kyle or probably after Kyle. That about makes sense.
Yeah.
But that's just online, baby. And here we are, podcasting. Heavy hands. All of us are surviving our coronavirus quarantine, just barely. And I wanted to bring Danny on today to talk about a topic that he explored in a recent article, of course, as all members of the Vaping Scooter Gang are required to do for initiation into the crew. He writes analysis for thefightsite.com, run by our good friend Kyle McLaughlin. And you recently wrote a piece, Danny, which, to my great dismay, has not yet been taken down for copyright infringement.
We're still in discussion, so stay tuned.
Yeah, our legal teams are currently hashing it out. So people who follow my Twitter may know that I frequently say very stupid things, and one of those is no less true for that, which is that MMA is a sport where guys who do stuff win. Essentially, aggression is it underscores almost everything in MMA. We have seen over the last few years this constant development towards greater pressure, greater volume. I don't know who is going to buck that trend, if it will be bucked, but I had this idea basically that because of the very nature of MMA, how many things there are to learn, how the fights are structured, how it's trained, it is a sport essentially where the most common piece of corner advice you hear is be first. And that is, in some ways, the most important thing in the MMA metagame. And Danny, you took this idea, which I have very rarely stated as intelligently even as I did there, and made it sound very, very smart. You wrote a great piece on the fight site about defense and initiative in MMA. And that is essentially the topic we're going to try to explore over the course of today's episode. We want to talk about initiative. What does it mean? Why is it important in MMA and fighting in general? And how is it particular? How is it particularly important to MMA, or how is its importance reflected particularly in MMA? So, Danny, thanks again for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. What is initiative?
This is the second metagame piece that I wrote, and I'll kind of connect them a little bit because I think that there's room to discuss a little bit of the cross between the two. And one of them is something that an idea that I threw at Phil after watching, what was it 243 or 240? No, it was 244. Was that Volkanovski Holloway? I don't remember which one it was.
I don't know.
Whatever that fight card was. And my idea was that I think as the sport progresses, there are times where the right strategic approach and having the right tactical efficacy behind it can sometimes upend traditional depth of skill in ways that you might not expect.
Mm-hmm.
And again, a lot of that does come from the fact that MMA just facilitates a lot of different phases, a lot of different possibilities. There's a lot of different ways to win an MMA fight. And then with my initiative piece, I kind of extrapolated on that a little bit further, that MMA is fundamentally a very different sport from boxing, which I realize the two kind of get compared quite a bit. But I think that what really drives the two apart is a lot of it is in initiative. I think boxers, as a result, for a myriad of reasons that we can discuss in a little bit, boxers, I think, learn to preserve themselves a little bit better from an early stage of development. They have more in-fight time to spend. Burning 9 minutes of a 36-minute fight is not the same as burning 10 minutes of a 25-minute fight. They're just very different things. And I think boxers have spent more time learning how to limit engagements, how to take away the weapons of their opponents, how to find their way around a problem in front of them. And I just haven't seen that kind of development from MMA. And so what it kind of boils down to is, like, it really does seem like an oversimplification, but it's kind of true. Guys who do stuff win the fights. Like, it is... Historically, you can look back and a lot of corner advice, a lot of training, a lot of how fighters have been coached, a lot of what they do just tends to be, you have to do more. You got to outwork your opponent. You got to own the engagements. You got to control the engagements. Because if you're not controlling the engagements, there's just a higher chance that a fight spirals out of your control.
Mm-hmm. Initiative it really is like one of those fundamental concepts that we don't actually outright talk about a lot, but it underscores almost everything we talk about, right? Like if I talk about a certain tactic being effective, like, oh, he did a great job because, for example, I said this about, did I say it about Joe B versus Jussier Formiga? Did I say it about, I think I said it actually most recently about Brandon Moreno and his win prior to Formiga, his win over Kai Kara-France. That one of the key elements to that victory was that he not only started the exchanges, he not only initiated, he had the first word and the last word. He made sure to initiate exchanges. He made sure to land the last shot or be throwing last in the exchanges. And like, I don't think I said it this way, but I could very well frame that as he made sure that he used initiative and that he maintained the initiative. That's an important, that's why that kind of tactic is effective, because you keep the opponent reactive. You make the opponent react, and then you end every exchange by giving them another reason that they should stay trying to guess what you are going to do. They should stay thinking about your intentions rather than their own. That's initiative in MMA. Phil, any thoughts?
So, yeah, I think a lot of the time when we end up talking about these fights, when we say who's going to win this fight, it is one of the first things we will say is that it's whoever's going to push the other guy backwards and whoever can potentially force the other one into the fence. And I think, yeah, it is for those reasons that you've laid out and for reasons that we've, discussed and we can get into in more detail with, the boxing versus MMA discussion, that it's simply very hard to be effectively defensive in MMA, and that often defense in one area results in trade-offs in other areas. And also that MMA is an extremely dynamic sport. Like, effective offense does not merely score points in this sport. It's the single sport where you're the most likely to just singularly win a fight by finishing the person.
Mm-hmm.
So if you combine like a high degree of variance and if you combine a high degree of variance, a high degree of basically like just fight-ending probabilities, together with like defense being very hard, and you end up, I think a general. Also, I think this has been improved by the general rounding out of skill sets.
Mm-hmm.
You get a sport which has become increasingly aggressive, because I think that's probably the key to why we've seen MMA increase in like its reliance on people to be offensive, is that skill sets have just become much more well-rounded. You cannot, and in that way, it meant that people were much more reluctant to be offensive because they felt that they might end up in the other person's wheelhouse. People were much more reluctant to step in with combinations because they thought if they were a combination striker, they thought, oh no, I might get taken down,
Mm-hmm.
and then I'm not particularly good off my back, or I'm just not a strong wrestler, or one of these other and everyone feared the gaps in their ancillary skill sets. So in this way, like now that most people are fairly skilled in almost every area, we get to see people. It simply becomes about factors which are more universal to MMA as a whole, and those are things like the dynamism, like the difficulty of defense.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I think we've basically, that's why we see this kind of trend towards being first. Although it is still notable that, like, I think when we discuss initiative, a lot of MMA is still relatively people don't actually want to go first.
No.
In MMA, I think a lot of even traditionally aggressive fighters often do not actually lead much. They will people that we think of as being aggressive, they will often feint and draw people into exchange and try and draw people into exchanges. But as we've seen with things like Romero versus Adesanya, you can get into situations where people are simply unwilling to be the first person out there. And this is, again, because I think, the things like the dynamism and the lack of defense means that people are unwilling to take that kind of first step into that probabilistic arena.
Because we had plenty to say about how that was not a smart approach from Israel Adesanya. But it is interesting to wonder if he would have been capable of producing such a bad fight in the kickboxing ring, right?
Mm-hmm.
Is there something something endemic to MMA that encourages such an elite striker to turn in such a snooze fest of not just a snooze fest. I mean, not just from an entertainment perspective, such an ineffective strategy in a fight, so muted. So yeah, that's kind of interesting. Like, Danny, do you have any thoughts on why pressure and aggression are so important in MMA beyond just the fact that there is so much potentially coming back at you? Actually, even before you say that, can I tell you guys about one of my least favorite things that I've been seeing in MMA ever since I first started watching the sport? This is a pattern that I'm sure you will both be familiar with. Okay, one fighter backs his opponent up. Maybe he throws a big overcommitted strike and the other guy skitters backwards 6 feet. That's a pretty standard thing. in MMA, especially, up to a certain level. It's very common. So the mere suggestion of a strike sends his opponent skittering back into the fence. The other fighter steps forward, realizes he has his opponent cornered, and backs off and lets him back into open space. This happens sometimes in boxing. Like, for example, you would, especially like before his fight with Bernard Hopkins, before he seemed to develop this somewhat, you saw this out of Sergey Kovalev a lot. I always thought of him as a forward momentum fighter, more so than a ring cutter, even, that he would prefer his opponent have room to run backwards. And I think the reason for that, like, as far as I can tell, it's just because when you corner somebody, they have to fight. They have to throw something. And so even though the people want to pressure, they get someone into a position where they are going to do something and they lose their nerve. Right, we didn't see this just from Adesanya against Romero. We even saw it against Anderson Silva, and we've seen it in how many Tyron Woodley fights. A person who literally, is not even necessarily a bad defensive fighter, can against a lot of guys afford to do very little, and his opponents can spend so much time with him backed up against the fence. But taking that final last step of initiating the exchange at that point becomes so much more difficult, and yet. This is why it's frustrating, so much more necessary. Like, that's the point at which you are supposed to start beating the shit out of the other guy when his back is to the fence. That's the worst position you can be in. It's why you have to fight back when you get there, because it's a bad place to be passive.
Yeah.
So is it just the fact that, like, once it gets to the point that your opponent has to do something, you are then confronted with just how many things they might decide to do? Is that, like, really the key to understanding the need to pressure, but also the difficulty with doing it effectively in MMA?
Yeah, I think that's part of it. People just aren't comfortable when they, oftentimes when opponents are going to be doing something at the same time.
Right.
And so this is, you could see, I think an example off the top of my head would probably be something like Moicano Aldo, where Moicano is someone who I think, Moicano is a good counter puncher and counter kicker, but he is someone who tends to need to control the range in front of him. And Aldo is just someone who's so screamingly fast that every time, Moicano would try to feint out a response, like, Aldo could be in and out in a split second before he even realized that he was being hit. Mm-hmm. And that made Moicano's feints and approach, he'd have to be even, he was walking an even tighter, even thinner line than expected. And I'm glad you brought up Woodley, because I think I talk about Woodley in my article as someone who, I think when we talk about defense in MMA, it's important to kind of understand the dichotomy between the two, is that I don't think a lot of fighters have developed offense and defense together.
Yes.
Like that, they tend to build in a fighter's, skill set opposite, and if not opposite, they don't tend to they don't work together.
Because neutrally on its own, Woodley has quite good defense. I've always said that he's got good parries. He can move his head. He's got some decent defensive footwork. Like, he's got a lot of options. He knows how to use them. Do they connect to any other part of his game is the fundamental issue. Right, and that is the thing, is that I know Woodley is, a lot of times he's branded as a counterpuncher, and is there sort of less culpable to initiate. But I don't necessarily think that's true, because Woodley doesn't even seem to want to enforce his own counterpunching game. Like, if you look at counterpunchers like, Conor McGregor or like Alexander Chablis, like, these are guys who will feint and prod and position themselves, their opponents up against the fence, and then, are greedy in trying to draw reactions. And if they're not going to draw reactions, then, as you pointed out, if an opponent isn't reacting to a feint, just throw the thing. Yeah. Always an available option. Yeah, it is available if it's a threat. So if the opponent isn't like threatened by the threat, then fine, here it is. Like, here's the what's behind the threat. And I think Woodley, I still don't know if I can pick Woodley against an opponent with some serious initiative. You're right. Because the
like, if you look at his past couple fights, it was Damian Maia, who's never going to beat him because Maia just either couldn't keep the pace or wasn't going to be able to take him down. And then you had Stephen Thompson, who had a lot of the similar problems. And it is notable that the opponents who were able to back Woodley up, and then they weren't afraid to control the engagements. They weren't afraid to feint, and they weren't, or in the case of Usman and Jake Shields, just walk in on him. That tends to be when Woodley's just blown out of the water, because like I said, I don't think his offense connects to his defense in any kind of meaningful, systematic way. Right. I don't think there's a lot of layers there.
Look at the Rory McDonald fight. I mean, for God's sake. Not a terrible defensive performance from Tyron Woodley. He picks off a lot of those jabs. He even starts checking a lot of those low kicks and so on and so forth, but doesn't ever get the initiative. And Rory McDonald is one of the few fighters he's faced comfortable sitting on the initiative with a cornered opponent in front of him. So,
yeah, I mean, I think a lot of so I think Connor's point about like backing people up and then not doing anything, I think this is often a question of, how do you grasp initiative in a fight? And this can be pretty tricky because a lot of, I think a lot of how people build combinations and exchanges, it does work from a probabilistic standpoint in that, you have a certain likelihood of landing this shot and then this shot. And I think a lot of the time when people force their opponent back into a negative, into a situation like they've got them back up against the fence, they tend to think, it feels to them like they have just won 3 coin tosses in a row. Like maybe ones which are, and they're like, and then the person on the, the cashier has been like, the croupier has been like, do you want to double down? And they're like, actually, maybe not this time. You think you pin the person up against the cage and you think, surely I've done all this stuff. They're going to explode out and I can counter them. And then they don't, and you've wasted everything. So I think one of the things which is hard about this sport, and probably about most combat sports in general, is that you have to be able to you have to be able to set up combinations in order to lead people into things, but you also have to be able to avoid that kind of thought where you're just thinking, I've gambled multiple times and then I haven't gotten away, and I've gotten away with it, but the reckoning is coming for me, because sometimes the reckoning actually isn't coming for you.
Right.
Sometimes it genuinely is probabilistic. It's genuinely favorable for you to be aggressive. I mean, a lot of the time, as we've mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I think Jack Slack always said this about the second Aldo Edgar fight, is that he was disappointed that Edgar didn't bullshit low kick Aldo just like to a points win. And I think, and that was because I think Edgar kept thinking, if I do this, eventually he's going to get me. If I keep piling up bullshit points on him, eventually he's just going to throw a huge counter through them and rip my head off. Like, look at this guy. He is, as Danny mentioned, he's an incredibly terrifying, offensive. He's just fast twitch, explosive danger.
He's
I
hot.
Cannot keep doing this.
What you're saying is he's extremely hot.
Yeah, of course. I mean, this was.
I have eyes.
Just say we're all thinking, Bill.
Yeah, I've got eyes in my head. Come on, we can all say it.
Yeah, but then a few years down the line, Volkanovski did basically just beat Jose Aldo with bullshit low kicks.
Yeah,
like he completely leveraged that game plan to a win, because he just never thought. He never thought like, oh no, I've gambled this so many times, it's not going to work this time. He actually. And in the end, it was the fact that Aldo had to start making the big gambles.
Right.
And
because that's why it frustrates me, I think, because the truth is that once you have the initiative, it builds on itself.
Yep.
Your opponent may do anything, but letting yourself be psyched out by that moment, and like curbing your own bullshit output, essentially. And I like that term. People who've read my articles know I like to talk about effective bullshit in fighting. Curbing your bullshit because you're worried the other guy might finally respond to it is exactly the wrong thing to do in a larger strategic sense, because the other person's options are necessarily going to be more limited. What they choose to do will be more ill-considered. It just makes sense to keep the other person reacting. Like I said, it is fundamental to fighting that the other person reacts to you. Fighting is fundamentally like reactionary or reactive in nature. Or like you are in there, your emotions are running high. You are making decisions not based on any kind of actual thought process most of the time, but based almost entirely on the muscle memory that you have drilled into yourself. So it just makes sense to keep the other person in this reactive frame of mind where their body is answering for them in increasingly predictable ways. That's the thing, is when you have the initiative, the other person's responses tend to get more predictable, not less. So it's heavily incentivized to push. We have seen that figured out, but it's interesting that guys like Woodley, like for as much as Max Holloway is like a clear example, or Alexander Volkanovski, perhaps even a more nuanced example of how to grab and then hold on to the initiative. As much as those guys exist, there's also like Tyron Woodley that he just like fits into this weird little pocket of, why it's necessary, but also why it's nerve-wracking to do this in MMA. Anyway, sorry, Phil, I got off on a tangent there. No surprise. You were saying?
No, that carries on from it pretty well, I think. It's just that. So I think the initiative is something which you generally want to claim. I mean, not always. Obviously, this is dependent on the fighter and who they're up against and what their skill set is. There's plenty of examples of people who have tried to pressure too hard out of the gate and have gotten killed for it.
Mm-hmm.
The classic, I think the most recent example which springs to mind being Moicano versus Korean Zombie. But we've also seen other examples of fighters where we've considered them to be like Robert Whittaker, who is, I think, he is a great initiative fighter, but it was his endless attempts to take the initiative which really got him badly undone by Israel Adesanya, because Adesanya was just looking for checkmate footwork positions that he could use to outmaneuver Whittaker as he blitzed in. And so, I think it can be easy to say that you just push people back, you always start the initiative, you always feint, and you always throw away shots. And I think that does remain true, that you want to close in, and I think feints and light volume, just like shots which don't particularly hurt, are still criminally underused in MMA. Because you can, the old pet slap is still criminally underused whether you're on the defense or the offense. Because
for whatever reason, the wisdom of Boss Rutan still carries tremendous weight in the sport.
Yeah.
Don't throw a jab, it's too light. You need to punch super fucking hard with everything you do. Yeah.
Yeah. But that a lot of the time, take the initiative at all costs can sometimes get you into serious trouble.
Yeah, this is a difficult topic to curtail, right? It's because like I said, it underscores everything. I want to try to direct it along a route that you sort of just opened there, Phil. We've sort of touched on. There's so much more we could say about why the the systematization. Oh, Jesus Christ! Why defense needs to be systematic to be consistently effective, and why it is so difficult to develop an all-encompassing system for a sport which, like the number of offensive techniques available have yet to be encompassed. It is just so broad and so deep because there are so many phases and so much anyone might do in any one of those phases. Developing systematic defense is tough. So I think that's at the heart of that sort of gambit of I've backed this guy up. I have the initiative. Do I want to use it? But what you just sort of mentioned is you might be acting in ways that are supposed to gain you the initiative, as Robert Whittaker was against Israel Adesanya. Do you have the initiative, though? Right? If the opponent does have a good feel for what you're going to do, whether it's as specific as I know what punch they're going to lead with every time, or if it's as broad as I know what direction they move in when they attack, or I know what distance they get to when they want to attack, or whatever. Do you have the initiative just by going first? And I would say, against good fighters, no.
Yeah.
Danny?
I think I think you raised a really good point there because I think Whittaker Adesanya is a good example of kind of the counterpoint here, which is that I just think MMA fighters are not that patient by nature.
Yes. And that is that is the essential ingredient to the entire counterpunching style is, are you patient?
Yeah. And that is, and that's a thing that can, like I said, it can get fighters just killed out the gate if they're so committed to just sort of playing their game. When they're not careful. The fighter that I generally point to in boxing is Alexander Usyk, as being someone who can, and often does, give a little bit of, give the first couple frames of a fight away, or if he's not just giving them to an opponent, like he'll contest, he'll compete, but he's just throwing out feelers. He's keeping the feints high, he's pivoting off, he's always taking an angle, he's feinting, he's working his jab, he's maybe hitting the body here and there, but he's not trying to just relentlessly take every minute from the opponent, right? He's not trying to win every exchange. And boxers are, if a boxer loses an exchange, they are the much more likely of the two to sort of take that information and be like, okay, this is what I learned from it. This is his first favorite punch, his second favorite punch. This is what he's going to want to do. I can use that little bit of initiative that I lost and internalize it, and then figure out how to use it later on.
Boxers in general just more comfortable, I think, with the very idea of losing an exchange.
Oh yeah,
it's okay. It's part of the process.
Yeah. Even like masterful performances in boxing, there may still be a losing exchange,
of course, here
and there.
There always are. It's part of it.
Yeah,
it's
always.
A fight.
It's just how it works. In MMA, I feel like it is more likely that fighters lose an exchange and then are suddenly anxious that they lost an exchange. They lose an exchange and they're suddenly worried that they've lost all the momentum in the fight, that they haven't gained any traction, that all of their work has been for naught and they've been one-upped.
It's almost like MMA is like a sword fight compared to a boxing match. Like, fighters are just not comfortable with the idea of losing an exchange. It's like as if the opponent was holding an edged weapon, meaning like one mistake might kill you. In this case, it's just because you don't know the nature of the mistake you might make. It might be just that deadly. You don't know what's coming back at you.
I think that's exactly right. And that's one of the reasons that I think the examples that we can look at in MMA of fighters who have full defensive systems that are, hard to find a perfect defensive system, but that are complete and that are layered and that have depth. Number two, that actually facilitate their own offense and don't just completely mute it. And three, can actually use that across like a 25-minute fight and in a strategic sense, in a broader sense. Like, the number of fighters who have all three of those things is very, very, very low. Jose Aldo is generally the one that I point to in this regard. But the other one that I point to is a pretty unique example, is Robbie Lawler. You know, prime Robbie Lawler when he had his resurgence in like 2013 and 2014. Because Lawler was someone who had, you know, and I know people don't really think of Robbie Lawler as being a defensive master, but he was a very good defensive fighter for MMA. He just fought in an aggressive way, which, you know, because that's just who he is, and he found a system that could work with his own aggression. But he was someone who figured out that kind of offensive system. He was someone who actually fundamentally understood that kind of boxing philosophy. Mm-hmm. You know, as Phil's talked about, the first round of the first Roy McDonald fight, the first 2 rounds of the first Johnny Hendricks fight, the first round of the Roy McDonald rematch. Like, he was someone who knew how to. He could afford to give away a round, and even if he wasn't going to lose it on the cards, you know, or maybe he did, but he wasn't putting himself in so much danger that he was risking getting killed, and he also wasn't. But he wasn't just wasting the time. He was using it to get a feel for the distance. He was using it to figure out what his opponent was going to throw. He was using it to, you know, to figure out like his own distance, like what he was going to counter with. He was kind of, you know, he was playing with the hands. He was slipping and rolling. He was you know, like there is so much value to that approach, and you just don't see it that often. I'm not saying everyone should try to be Robbie Lawler. Obviously, there are some very specific athletic and just pathological characteristics that made Robbie Lawler. But it's unique, and it was like a uniquely, you know, quote unquote boxing approach for MMA, and you don't see it very often. I mean, it is notable that he often walked a knife's edge in terms of judges' scorecards, and then, you know, when his output started to wane, he often just got hideously outpaced. But, like, you know, it's notable to me that he made it work.
Yeah, that's the thing is the trouble with MMA, and this is why I harbor a deep and abiding hatred for this sport, is that like the structure of like how fights are organized does not encourage that kind of fighting. You know, like I can't really blame fighters for not wanting to be Robbie Lawler. I mean, everyone wants to be Robbie Lawler. But
not everyone can be Robbie Lawler.
Right. I can't blame them for looking at this sport in which the vast majority of their career fights are going to be only 3 5-minute rounds and think I should develop a style in which I'm very likely to give away the first one of those, at least.
Yeah.
You know, and Lawler frequently gave away more than one. So I don't know, like, it's not only is it just the difficulty in developing that systematic defense in the first place, having a system which accounts for all of the stuff that, you know, all the shit that might be flying at your face, or your legs or your body or your hips or your neck or whatever. But also, you know, is it just worth it strategically to invest in? It's already a difficult thing to acquire. Is it worth going through that effort for most fighters? Because I don't know. Like I think of Chito Vera, as I do all day, every day. I think of Chito Vera, and I think like he is just like his style is like so dumb. Really, like at its core, and I don't mean this to disparage him. I love Chito Vera. He's one of my favorite people on earth. But his style, really, at its core, is just like go out there and do stuff, and it works. Like he loses when he's not doing stuff, and when he starts doing stuff, he wins every single fight. This is the pattern. Like there's no mystery to the dropping the first round and then coming on late. It's just because he starts throwing shit. And he refuses to. He starts accepting exchanges when his opponent does attack, just saying, "Okay, if you're going to attack me, I'm going to attack you back." And then when they retreat from the exchange, he attacks more, and that's it. The more he does that, the more he wins, and the more violently. So, like, I can't blame fighters for not wanting to turn into Robbie Lawler. Like, is it achievable for most fighters? I don't know.
Also, like, Robbie Lawler lost a ton.
Yeah.
Like,
oh yeah.
He lost he lost early in his career, and then he kind of lost late in his career.
Sure.
And he had, even in his prime, he had tons of razor close decisions.
Very close fights.
And he never really beat a super high paced like blow kicker. This is like the problem is that one of the things that Danny, you as the dark heart of the vaping scooter gang have also said is that one of the notable things about MMA is that everyone sucks. And
wait,
a little bit.
And
I need that to be elaborated on. Go on.
But I mean, it's just that the problem is that I think a lot of the time when we're looking at MMA and this sport is that there's a tendency, similar to people in history looking at their era, is to think, now we're here. Now we're at the level when it's good.
Now it's the end of history. It's always the end of history.
Yeah. So people tend to think like now is the region, or now the time where I've been, consuming this has been pretty much, the time at which it is good. And in some ways that has been, informed by just how much the sport has improved. But, we've gone from very, very we've gone in a pretty short amount of time from just Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu to then, wrestling with a little bit of Jiu-Jitsu to then sprawl and brawl to the eventual like expansion into the whole ecosystem that we have going today.
Mm-hmm.
But that sort of doesn't imply that there isn't a whole lot left of development left to do. And, someone like Robbie Lawler was incredibly skilled, but as we've mentioned with guys like Jim Miller, for example, he was also contextually skilled because he was still someone who never really did tremendously well with a concerted range and low kick game. He would still, like, that time that he spent like taking the fight off often got him kind of crippled. He was pretty fortunate to beat Melvin Manoof, as awesome as that KO was.
Yeah.
But so he developed a skill set which worked, which allowed him to go very deep against the people that were willing to go deep with it. Sorry, deep into it with him.
Yeah. Go on.
Yep.
And Robbie
Lawler goes deep. We get it.
Yep.
All of us want to go deep in Robbie Lawler. All right, Phil, move on.
I feel like you two are ganging up on me.
This is by far the most homoerotic episode of this show yet. We're gonna get
really saying something, but but this is the thing, and to develop that skill cost him years and years and years. It cost him insane amounts of damage, which would have destroyed most people long before they ever got to that point. And then it got him very briefly to a championship belt that he won in a kind of sketchy decision, as much as it was awesome to watch. And then it's gotten him into a reasonably hard decline. So you'd have to look at people and be like, do you want to be Robbie Lawler? Do you want to be so incredibly confident in your own skill? Do you want to be so stubborn in learning skill in the pocket that this is your career? You will struggle through life at the beginning for ages. You will have a brief time at the top, and then you will be used as an action fighter, punching bag, until you retire. And
an area of skill that, as you said, is so narrow, or as you put it, contextual, context dependent, that I would go further and say that it wasn't just that his need to draw things out and get a read on the opponent allowed Melvin Manhoff to chew his legs up. It was also that in pouring so much of his energy and his thought into developing a boxing-based defense game, he left himself particularly vulnerable to having his legs chewed up. How worthwhile is that for most fighters to invest that much time in something that, Like, in order to develop enough depth to rely on it the way Robbie Lawler did, it is going to have to become so narrow that eventually some fighter is going to exploit the wide openings surrounding your area of expertise.
Oh, I totally agree with all that. I didn't bring Lawler up as an example of, like, this is how everyone should fight. This is like the defensive example in MMA that everyone should be striving for. It was more like he was a rare example of a fighter who built a defensive system and was actually able to employ it offensively at a high level, and understood some of these sort of, I'm gonna just, without lack of a better term, quote unquote, boxing philosophies that are actually, that can be of use in MMA, which is just sort of, spending some time to figure out your own approach. Again, a lot of Lawler, what made Lawler was great, and a lot of it was quite poor, and I think his career has kind of bore that suspicion out. It's just notable to me that he was able to make it work, because I can't quite think of many other fighters who have done the same thing.
Right. So let's talk about fighters who don't use defense aggressively, who don't use their defense as a complement to a pressuring game like Robbie Lawler so often did. Like something that has always been fascinating to me is I think I've probably read a million quotes from the likes of Archie Moore and George Benton and Jack Blackburn and like all these people that Mike McCallum, I'm pretty sure, has said something like this, that the trick to counterpunching, the trick to defensive fighting is not to be able to guess or so quickly identify what your opponent is throwing that you can then react, but to know what they're going to throw. Or to put it another way, to make them throw the punches you want to throw. To essentially lead without leading is kind of how a lot of these fighters seem to kind of frame the idea of initiative off the back foot or initiative on the counter. First of all, like, I want to ask, is it possible in MMA? But before anyone answers, I want to say that I do think it is. And once again, I think we can learn, as we have been throughout this episode and as I have been through my whole career covering MMA, from boxing. Because boxers understand this shit. Like Danny, you talked a lot in your article about boxers, because when it comes to defense and like the nuances of feeling and controlling the pace and the flow of a fight on the feet, there is no one who does it better across the board than just any old boxer. So I'll go to one example that I continually think of. Jimmy Rivera versus Uriah Faber. I think I put this in an article once, which is probably why it comes to mind. But there is an exchange where Jimmy Rivera he's a counterpuncher at heart. I think that's what he likes to do best. And there's a moment in the first round of that fight where he and Faber are kind of moving around each other. And I think there's a moment, I'm seeing this from the outside, but I think there's a moment where Rivera realizes he does not have the initiative. He feels that he has lost it. As Faber is moving forward, each time Faber moves, Rivera has to take a step in adjustment. Faber moves forward again, Rivera has to take a step back. He realizes that he is defending his position from Uriah Faber more than he is doing anything to set up an exchange that he could then have a sort of a half anticipated response for. And what he does is he resets. And I think this is a very important thing that a lot of MMA fighters don't understand. A lot of times a reset is just to relieve pressure. But in this case, Jimmy breaks away. He gets out of range. He moves away from the fence, which has been creeping up towards his back, and repositions himself in open space and then starts pressing forward right away. And I think the purpose of that reset is to just take himself out of a situation where initiative is like a pattern, like one move informs the next. It's a series of reactions. And I think a lot of times you can just sort of reset that pattern. You could just sort of break away and be like, okay, we're going to start now a new chain reaction, and I'm going to be the one to make the first move, and that'll give me a better feel for how to control the flow of that reaction as it unfolds. Do you have any thoughts on that, Danny? Defensive styles and how to claim initiative without just having to be the dumb guy who swings first?
Yeah, I think that's a good example, is that just being able to reset off the back foot. I mean, if you look at MMA, footwork on the back foot is, again, nowhere near the level that boxing is.
Right.
It's the same reason that you have guys will just walk themselves into the fence when they see Khabib walking at them.
Right.
It's the same reason that, there really are not that many great pivoting fighters off the back foot who instead of trying to either take, sort of shuffle back, or even in the case of, fighters with very good footwork like Israel Adesanya will sometimes just shift off the back foot in longer steps. Like, it is just useful to be able to pivot, and in both directions, but even just, whatever your stance is,
even just in the one easy direction. I mean,
yeah,
you're aware.
Yeah,
you're aware. I don't
sort of step across your body. Yeah, just pivot pivot off your stance and pivot off your jab.
Yeah. This is number one.
The classic example that comes to mind. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying this is the number one Alexander Gustafsson hate show on the internet. So you're well aware of our love.
I don't think it is. It's definitely the fight site one.
You're taking everything we worked for. God damn it.
That's really why we're here, yeah. Mm-hmm. So I think obviously the classic example is Jose Aldo, who I still think has the best defensive system of any fighter I've ever seen in the sport. And I really don't even think that there's a close second, if I'm being honest.
I agree with you 100%.
And it's because he had different moves off the back foot, and they weren't. I mean, that's the thing, is they're not just. I'm going to start again, because this is a kind of an important key. Mm-hmm. The difference between having moves and having a system, those are not the same necessarily. Like, with a fighter who has defensive moves, I think, you could look at someone like Kelvin Gastelum moving his head against Israel Adesanya. He did a better job, but it wasn't really connected to his offense in any way, and it was more of just, he wasn't moving at his hips to sort of get an angle or sort of, play with Adesanya's reactions. It was just moving his head to get offline. Mm-hmm. It was a move, and it was doing a better job than he's done in the past, but it was still pretty limited. A system is someone who actually has moves on top of moves on top of moves in different places. So if that's your head movement combined with your trunk movement, combined with your pivots, combined with your ability to drag and pull shots out of the way, and your blocks, that's what makes Aldo and why he's the example that I always go to in these regards, because he was someone who could take a slight, he could take a back step, but it was always at a slight angle. If an opponent was trying to rush in on him, he could pivot off his jab, or he could, turn the corner with his left hook.
Yes.
If he was pushed up against the fence, which again, very hard to do, he was, another fighter who does this was Eddie Alvarez. He would feint both directions. He would wait for you to commit with your step and then, move out the side while he's rolling his head at the same time. These moves all connected. They were all you've said it before, Connor and Phil, I think just flow charting your way through a fight. Mm-hmm. You can do that defensively. And it just, again, it is notable that it presumably takes an insane amount of hours in the gym and, a serious high level of coaching to employ it against a lot of different kinds of styles, but it is possible. And then, so if that's part one, the other thing is being able to actually take weapons away from your opponent. And you don't see that very often either. I think when I wrote that sort of large Adesanya piece is one of the things, I mean, the Romero fight was not, didn't really age it that well, but, at least in his kickboxing and before then, and in the Whittaker fight, the jump from the Gastelum fight to the Whittaker fight was that Adesanya did a much better job of obstructing Whittaker's first punch. So, he would always reach out and paw or grab at the lead hand. He was always aware when it was going to come. He had he was trying to get offline. He was pulling his head far back, just out of range of the left hook, which was kind of going to be Whittaker's opening strike in a lot of these exchanges. He was always trying to obstruct one of Whittaker's weapons and just take away a reliable one. And that's great when you can see opponents do that.
It's a key
when you can see fighters.
It's a key to good defense is being able to, like, giving yourself the freedom to ignore certain things. If you have to consider everything all the time, you will never be an effective defensive fighter. You get yourself to a point where you can sort of look past those initial threats and think about, like, the real shit that's coming on the back of them.
And I think Phil's talked about that before with Aldo. Is he someone who, he's not someone who's like aware of every single thing that an opponent's going to throw. He's someone who's just built a system that's so airtight that he doesn't have to think about most of it.
Yeah.
Like it's just reactionary. Like whether it's like, a quick slip, a slight angle off the back foot, whether it's, a counter jab on, these are things he doesn't really have to consider them very much. Then when opponents do push him deeper into exchanges, he can go to that level. Mm-hmm. And that's, so it's like he's not, it's not that he's not thinking about his opponent. It's just that he's built a system where he doesn't have to think that hard.
Yeah. And like Floyd Mayweather, I've always said this about him, like not having to think about those things on a tactical level does free your mind to think about the larger picture of the fight. It does free your mind to ask, why am I getting into this exchange? Why is he throwing that punch? Why should I react this way versus this way? When all of the simple how questions of how do I not get hit by his jab over and over are basically like subconscious or unconsciously done.
But I also think, like, I'm going to be the contrarian again here, slightly. I think this is why we love Jose Aldo, and why in some ways that tricks us a little. Because he's someone that makes, I think there's no fighter that makes, when he's working and when his approach is functioning, there's no fighter that makes MMA look more explicable, makes it look more like clean and refined, and like it's even possible to like fight in this way. Because as we've mentioned initiative as being very important, being the person who moves forward and, forces the issue and so on. And ironically, we all love Jose Aldo. He doesn't really do that very much.
Right.
And I think that's kind of why we love him, because he is fundamentally against against the sort of trend of this sport. He makes it seem like it's evolved to a level which, in some ways, I mean, it hasn't, even including him.
And it doesn't just feel like a bug exploit like Tyron Woodley's style does, It's like he has figured out a genuine system for fighting differently than most people in this sport do.
But I also do feel like Volkanovski in particular, but Matt Holloway as well, they did show, that style still can't really exist in MMA, or at least that it can still be pulled apart in the same way that it's pulled apart at a higher level than Robbie Lawler's, but it still can be pulled apart. That like, being a clean defensive fighter, because, both of those guys in different ways, Max Holloway he used his jab to pull out defensive options until he could read and capitalize on them. Because whilst Aldo had a deep library, it was still a library that would occasionally end up with him in bad positions, in that, he would move his head 3 times and then pivot back, and then he would be standing in a terrible, eventually Holloway was able to figure out the checkmate positions, and Volkanovski, as mentioned, was able to build up significant points leads with kind of low scoring garbage. And both of these were, like, as we've mentioned, numerous times on the show, were genius like adaptations and strategic performances. Like, I'm not taking anything away from them at all. But Yeah, so like Aldo he's an aspirational fighter for me. Like it's something it's somehow like it's always tragic for me to watch him in that way, because I still feel like it's a style which it's a style of a for an MMA which doesn't really exist. I mean, I think a lot of people would feel the same way about Lyoto Machida if they looked back at him back in his era, because he made it look. And, nowadays in the modern era, it's very easy to look back at Lyoto and just be like, that guy was incredibly fucking boring and he didn't do anything a lot until people ran into him. He was a karate Tyron Woodley. And it's not dissimilar, right? It's not like he really could be pretty boring. I'm sorry, Connor. I'm sorry.
Shut your fucking mouth.
He could have some real stinkers, and he could get into competitive fights with people that didn't belong to be in there with him.
100%.
But he could also have, incredible knockouts and all that kind of stuff. But that was why a lot of people were drawn to him, because he was this aspirational kind of figure. But I think in the end, at all these periods of MMA, that it's still the idea that you can be the defense-only fighter, I think is I just don't believe we're there yet. Like, we're not. There is no. Even Jose Aldo cannot be Floyd Mayweather or Willie Pep for MMA.
But it's not defense only. It can't be defense only. It's defense first.
Yeah,
it's defense as a priority.
Yeah,
or as Danny has said several times in several ways, like as an offensive tool in its own right, as something which, like a jab, sets up offense. I don't know. I on the one hand, I basically started this episode being like, yeah, MMA, all of what we get, all of this incredibly, like just dumb, brutish fighting is encouraged by MMA. The sport incentivizes a volume-focused pressuring style, and not always a particularly nuanced one, because so frequently in so many corners, the main piece of advice is you go first. And it turns out most of the time that is the key factor that decides a lot of these fights. But on the other hand, like, I do think there is something approachable in what a great fighter like Jose Aldo does, or what Robbie Lawler does. Like, I always like boiling things down to simple concepts, much more than I like talking about like the actual little mechanical pieces of a given technique as opposed to another one or whatever. For me, like, people will often say footwork is the most important. I would go even more like base level than that. And I would say the failing of a lot of MMA fighters when striking is simply that they do not understand position. More than even footwork, more than how you move, knowing what a good position feels like, what a bad position feels like. And to dumb it down even more, the way it was first explained to me is a good position, right, or a good angle, or however you want to phrase it. Position encompasses angle, it encompasses elevation, it encompasses distance. But a good position is one in which you are facing your opponent and he is not facing you. And if you can train your mind as a fighter to have that be like your chief consideration, it does the same job that having a fully systematic defense does. It frees you to think about larger, more important questions. It frees you from having to try to guess each individual move that might be coming your way, because fewer moves will be coming your way, and the ones that do will be less effective. So like this has always been the genius of Jose Aldo, is not just that, like the fact that he beats a looping right hand and a double leg shot with the same piece of footwork is not an accident. It's not something only Jose Aldo can do. It's because it's position. Don't give your opponent a straight line. Don't give them the leverage to actually execute their technique definitively. And the same essential moves can really deal with a wide array of different attacks. So I think like the key to being able to seize initiative without just having to be the brute who swings the first punch and then keeps swinging is to know when you don't have to worry about the swings, to know when you are able to start swinging without having to worry about what comes back at you. That solves a lot of these problems that seem inherent to MMA. That solves the problem of, I don't know, I feel nervous about leading now that I've actually put my opponent in a position where he has to fight back. Well, if I feint and he doesn't do anything and then I step offline as I come in with my attack, I guess, maybe he'll escape off the fence, but what is he really going to be able to hit me with when I do that? I don't know. Do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's probably a pretty good way to put it. You can look at certain fighters who put positioning first, and actually, a lot of pressure fighters do.
Yeah, you have to. Your position in the cage and your position relative to the opponent.
It's just a philosophy of the style. And I think you guys talked about Woodley Usman as being like, Woodley's style is something like, well, I can't be out-positioned if my back is to the wall.
Uh-huh.
Like if I'm right here, I know exactly my distance to the cage, and I'm sort of see my distance to my opponent, then there's no way that I can be, I have my exits open, but there's no way that I can actually I can have a dominant angle taken on me because there's no space to go. There's no place for you to maneuver around.
Sitting in the corner booth, watching the front door.
Yeah. Exactly. I like my sort of what I really wanted to get across with this article wasn't like I didn't write it in the sense that everyone needs to be Aldo, everybody needs to be Lawler. Like these are all the things that you're missing, so go learn them. Mm-hmm. Because I understand like when you try to implement different parts, and this is sort of why defense tends to be the last thing that fighters develop. And like they're worried about their own positioning, like they're worried about their own placement to their opponents, and it is a subtle kind of balance. And if something in a fight starts to disrupt that, say like a common one would just be a jab. If it starts bloodying up your nose and you can't see as well, mm-hmm. then like something is simple and as fundamental as your own positioning can go out of the window. And even great fighters have this issue.
Sure.
So that was kind of, I think positioning is kind of the right way to put it. And there's a bunch of different ways that you can accomplish that. As far as like the footwork fighters that I generally point to is, Aldo's one of them, but I also think Adesanya has some lovely tricks with his own positioning, whether it's, where he's planting his feet or in his ability to actually shift off the back foot. I think he's quite good at it. Mm-hmm. Edward Vartanian is someone who is often actually understands a lot of the keys behind shifting and fighting out of both stances. Like he's a really unique switch hitter for mm-hmm. MMA. There's not many.
I would mention Jimmy Rivera again, honestly. As
Rivera's a good shout. Yeah, Alvarez, Alvarez, especially when he's up against a pressure fighter. Mm-hmm. Someone who's just sort of going to come straight at him. He's always someone who's very keen on, knowing his own position in the cage. And I've always kind of wondered that, like the difference between a cage and a ring. Like the ring is just a lot smaller and a lot narrower, and it's just more rigid. So with the fence, I'm like, is it less of a priority in training because fighters just feel like they have more space with which to work? Whereas in the ring, it's like they have to, in boxers, they have to learn, every square inch of the ring because they're probably going to be at some point in every square inch during a fight. I don't know. That's just more of a question mark. I don't know if there's really an answer to it.
Yeah. Boy. Well, I have to physically restrain myself from trying to use that question as a spring pad into a further discussion. We could easily continue this or attack it from another angle next time. But I think we should probably wrap it up there. And clearly, as you guys may have figured out, we didn't stop for break, so this will be chopped up later. I thought this might be best to just have one continuous discussion. That's the proper way, I think, to approach broad fundamental concepts like initiative and positioning and like defense as a stylistic priority. These are big questions. So, Danny, thank you so very much for joining us, man. That was super enjoyable, at least for someone as pathetic and nerdy in their fandom of fighting as I am.
This is your chance, Danny.
No, I thank you guys for having me. This was tons of fun. I mean, God knows when the things are going to go back to normal. So, I mean, I would love to come on again if there's an opportunity. But this is I knew this was going to be a big discussionary topic. And there's no real right answer. But I'm just glad I was able to chop it up with you guys.
Yeah, there is no end to the back. Just like in the fight itself, there is no end to like how initiative operates. There is always an opportunity to seize it, to get the opponent thinking about you rather than the other way around.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Phil?
Yeah, this was great fun. And yeah, it's always fun it's sometimes fun to be able to get away from the grind, as we've said several times. Unfortunately, it looks like the gap between fights is going to go on for quite some time. But yeah, it was really cool talking more conceptually about the sport.
Yeah. So Danny, I mentioned your piece on the fight site. That's thefight-site.com. I think it was called something like On Defense and Initiative in MMA.
Yeah, MMA metagame, defense, and initiative.
Are there any other pieces that you would like to tell our listeners about, and or anything coming up soon, or where can they find your other work?
Well, see, that's the thing, is because we're at sort of at a standstill. It actually gives our staff a little bit of time to stretch our legs with pieces and just write stuff that we want to have a little bit of fun with. I don't know if we have any like major, because at this point, is Khabib Tony canceled yet? I don't actually know. Is it officially off?
Well, Dana White has assured me.
Oh yeah,
that it's happening. Yeah, he has a as I think MMA Twitter must follow leg kick TKO put it. He has a little secret that you're not allowed to know the location of where the fight's taking place, but it is definitely going to take place.
It's happening. You got to believe it's happening. So I this is the point where I'm supposed to plug, but I really honestly don't know. I would say, just sort of keep a lookout on the fight site for all the stuff that we write, because we might, our writers may actually get a chance to just sort of bank some stuff out that we haven't really had a chance to do, which is cool.
Yeah.
But if not, like, this may also be a time where we just sort of look back as opposed to looking forward, because there isn't a whole lot on the horizon at the moment.
Yeah. And of course, you can also find Danny on Twitter at dmarty77 if you want to get yelled at on the internet. Phil?
That's right.
Any plans? Anything you've got coming out, cooking up?
No, I'm just going to be, fighting the existential void and staring at the wall. I've still got a few old pieces that I've been thinking about resurrecting, but nothing that would be in anything like a state that I could produce it in the next few days.
Yeah, I've got a couple things on the fire. I don't like to actually plug things or tell people to look for them anymore.
Because then you got to write them.
Yeah, because then I have to write them, and usually when it comes down to it, I get that article right up against the cage, and I'm like, maybe next exchange.
The best. Fuck you, come up with.
Fuck it, it can wait.
I'm gonna back up.
Hypocrite.
Yeah, what if it hurts me? So. But I am working on a couple pieces, like one about judging. We had a lot of either questionable scores turned in, or fights that were just genuinely difficult to score. And I'm interested in not only in my perspective on judging fights, but also the ways in which I think it could be made easier and more consistent. So there might be something like that coming out soon. We'll see if the global economy doesn't collapse first. But goddamn it, Heavy Hands will continue. We're going to keep bringing on guys like Danny. Big thanks again, Danny, for joining us. And,
thank you, guys.
Of course. And thank you all so much for listening. If you came here today for the finer points of face punching, you came to the right place. This has been Heavy Hands.